Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bent Limbs Podcast. I am your host, Matt Thielking, and today on our very first episode, episode number 1, we are going to talk about paper tuning your crossbow. So I wanted to start this podcast series off with the item that I learned the most from and benefited the most from. And when I just kind of reflected back on the last year or two, some of the things that I've tinkered around with, my friends and I have tried with different bows, different setups, different broadheads, different whatever related to crossbows. When I thought about what did I learn the most from and what did I benefit the most from, paper tuning my bolts with my crossbow was definitely the thing that benefited me the most, not only with my shooting, but also when I was out hunting. So that's what I want to start this off with for you guys today. But before we do, just a couple of introductory items, I guess. The whole reason I'm starting this podcast series is, I guess, one, I'm a huge podcast fan. I listen to hunting podcasts pretty much every day while I'm at work. I absolutely love listening to them. I learn a ton from podcasts. But I'm a big crossbow hunter. I love hunting with a crossbow here in my home state of Michigan. And I just haven't found very many podcasts dedicated solely to crossbows and crossbow hunting. So I thought, let's give this a shot. So here we are. So I'm bringing a podcast to you guys that hopefully you enjoy, related to all crossbows and all crossbow hunting. Also, really quick, I just want to be perfectly transparent with you guys and let you know that I am sponsored by a crossbow company. That company is Killer Instinct Crossbows. I'm very proud to represent that brand. It's actually a pro staff position that I applied for because that's what I hunt with. That's what I like. And I'm just super lucky, super blessed to have a sponsorship with them. But in saying that, I do just want you guys to know that I may shoot KI crossbows and that might be my preference, but that is certainly not going to be the sole focus when we talk about crossbows, different technology, different brands, or have people on this podcast series related to crossbows. It's not going to be all KI stuff. I just wanted to be perfectly transparent with you guys as to who I'm affiliated with. So that's it for introductory items. Let's start talking about paper tuning a crossbow. So my friends and I got involved with this by watching the Ranch Fairy. If you don't know who the Ranch Fairy is, I highly recommend that you check out his YouTube channel. He's got a lot of great content on compound bow, arrow building, how to tune your arrow to your bow, high FOC setups, why you should shoot heavier arrows. It's a lot of, I just really like it. I think that content is really valuable. I also think the way he does it is really easy to do for kind of the average hunter, the everyday hunter. And it translates really, really well into crossbows. And that's essentially what we did, is we just took all of the Ranch Fairy's methods and practices and just started doing them with our crossbows. So if you have watched the Ranch Fairy, you know that he is a big proponent of heavier setups, high FOC setups, which I am too. I like those. I have seen the results of those not only with my shooting at targets, but also harvesting game, and so have my friends. I 100% agree with what he's doing and what he's saying. But he also talks about perfect arrow flight. So that's what I really want to focus on for this paper tuning episode, is perfect bolt flight, because nothing replaces perfect bolt flight. No amount of FOC or bolt weight is going to compensate for crappy bolt flight. Perfect bolt flight is the goal, and that is the goal for us paper tuning. The paper is our indicator to know whether or not our bolt is flying perfect or near perfect as soon as it leaves our bow. And the reason we want to know if our bolt is flying perfect or near perfect as soon as it leaves our bow, or within the first couple yards of it leaving our bow, is because that is the most unstable point of our bolt launching from our bow. I mean, it is being loaded up with a ton of force, a ton of energy from our bow. And if it's flying goofy or erratic right out of the gate, we want to know that, and we want to try to do some things to correct it. Because if we can get it flying perfect or near perfect right away, that is going to translate into more speed, or I should say less speed loss. If our bolt is flying crazy coming out of our bow, our fletchings have to do a whole lot more work to correct that. And the more our fletchings are in there in the wind, correcting erratic bolt flight, the more speed we're losing from our bow. Then that also translates to energy loss. The more our fletchings have to correct things with our bolt, the more energy that we're losing from our bolt. So if we can launch that bolt perfect or near perfect right away, it is going to just translate the entire way to our target as better bolt flight, better accuracy, better speed retention, better energy retention, ultimately resulting in a just better overall around setup and better performance on game. So let's start with, I guess, the steps and what you need to start paper tuning your crossbow. Number one, you obviously need some paper. My friends and I just use 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper just because it's easy, but you can really use whatever paper you want. The key is just make sure that paper is tight. So you're shooting through that paper, you're going to be analyzing how your bolt tears when it goes through that paper. You want to make sure that it's tight because you don't want any false indicators. If it's loose or flapping around or wrinkled or whatever, you don't want to get a tear that is just because you had a bad paper setup and not be a reflection of your bow. You want that paper to be 100% an indicator of how your bow is shooting. So just make sure it's tight, whatever it is that you use. And you can do that in a multitude of different ways. We use a scrap piece of round stock that we welded up and just kind of made a little welded frame that we can stick in the ground, and we can easily tape an 8.5 by 11 to it. You could use 2x4s and make a frame. You could use a big cardboard box and cut a window out so you can tape a piece of paper nice and tight to it. You could use old arrow shafts or some type of stake to just hold that piece of paper tight between the two stakes. It really doesn't matter. Just the number one thing or the number one item on kind of your how to paper tune list is make sure that paper is tight. Number two, you want to make sure that your piece of paper is about 15 to 20 feet away. 5 yards ish is what we normally use. And that's what the ranch fairy used to, because that seems to be a good distance of catching that erratic bolt flight kind of at its max, if you will, before your fletchings start kicking in and correcting things. So that distance is one that he uses when he paper tunes his compound bows. That's one that we just copied for our crossbows, and it has proven to be a good distance as an indicator for our crossbow. So 15 to 20 feet, number two on the list. Number three is your target, whatever you're going to put behind your piece of paper to stop your crossbow bolt. You want to make sure that is, I'm going to tell you, 3 feet behind your piece of paper. In reality, it doesn't have to be 3 feet. It just has to be a greater distance than the length of your bolt. The reason for that is you don't want your bolt impacting your target before it completely passes through that piece of paper, because you might get some goofy tears if your bolt hasn't completely passed through that piece of paper. It hits your target, wiggles around a little bit, and tears the paper in a weird way. You just don't want to be chasing your tail. And trust me, we've chased our tail with that because we have definitely set up our target too close, had some goofy indicators that when we simply moved our target back and realized our bolt wasn't passing all the way through the piece of paper before it hit our target, it saved some headache for us. So just make sure that your bolt can pass 100% through that piece of paper before it smacks your target. Number four, you want to be shooting at your target on the same plane as your target. So you don't want to be shooting uphill or downhill. Again, you don't want to be having like angled tears through that piece of paper that would be giving you false indications. So try to shoot your bow as level or on the same plane as your piece of paper as you can. Really just don't be shooting at it uphill. Don't be shooting at it from an elevated tree stand. Same plane, ground level, as straight through that piece of paper as you possibly can. And with that level, us talking about shooting through things level, you also want to make sure your bow limbs are level. You don't want them tilted left or right, because that can too give you some goofy tears through your piece of paper. And we experienced that firsthand. And the best advice that I have for you as to how to make sure your bow limbs are level are not trying to like level your bow limbs and hold it in place. Like, you don't have to put a level actually on your bow limbs, or be necessarily shooting on a level platform. I mean, if you can, that should work. But what we found worked the best was to make sure our whatever was holding our piece of paper, be it a 2x4 frame or a box or whatever, was to either make sure that the side or the top of that was level, or put some other indicator next to that piece of paper to give us a level indicator that we could align our reticle up with. So that seemed to be the easiest thing for us, is if our paper was level or we had some level indicator next to our paper, we could align our bow reticle up with that, know that our bow is then level, and then shoot through that piece of paper. Okay, so now that we have our setup for paper tuning ready to go, we are ready to start shooting. The first thing that we're going to do, or I guess I should say, the first thing that my friends and I did, and that this worked for us as kind of the order of operations, was we did a fletched Nock tune. So what you are going to do is basically shoot each of your 3 fletching positions as the odd feather down. And you're going to do that by rotating your Nock. So your actual odd feather, I would just mark that as number 1. And then the other 2 fletchings, number 2 and number 3, and shoot each of them. Shoot number 1 first through that piece of paper, turn your Nock. So then number 2 is down when you put it in your crossbow, shoot that, do the same thing for number 3. And what you're doing when you are doing a Nock tune, is you are finding the orientation at which your crossbow best shoots your bolt's strong side and your bolt's weak side. Crossbow bolts, when they're made, they just inherently, for lack of a better term, they have a strong side and a weak side. You don't know where it is. You don't know whether your bow best shoots it up or down or left or right or whatever. All you know is that each bolt has a strong side and a weak side, and by twisting your Nock to the 3 different fletching positions, you're just finding that fletching position and that strong side, weak side orientation that your bow shoots best, and your indicator is your piece of paper. So you're going to get tears when you shoot through that piece of paper. And now we're kind of at the point where we can kind of pick a couple different avenues. So if all you're going to do is Nock tune, if that's it, if you don't want to mess around with anything else, if you don't want to mess around with point weight or insert weight or things like that, if all you want to do is Nock tune your bow, then shoot whatever point weight, whatever broadhead weight you normally use, and just pick whichever of the 3 is the closest to a perfect bullet hole as you can get, and go with that. And you're going to want to do that for every single bolt, even if all your bolts are the same brand, if they're the same model, doesn't matter. Each individual bolt you need to Nock tune. So if you want to stop here, you can, and this will definitely help you. It will definitely increase your accuracy. I think you'll be surprised as to simply twisting your Nock, how much of a difference that makes for your bolt flight, your broadhead flight, just your overall performance from your crossbow. If you really want to, though, take it to one more level and really try to achieve that perfect bullet hole, if you don't get one with whatever it is, whatever point weight that it is that you're shooting right now, adding and subtracting point weight can help with different tears from your Nock tune. So if you do want to go down that route, I would suggest that you start your Nock tune with the lightest point possible. We started with 100 grains. There's not a ton of stuff lighter than that realistically where you can match a broadhead to it. So we started with 100 grains. We did our fletched Nock tune, and instead of we kind of looked at which one was best. But if we didn't get one that was close to a perfect bullet hole, the fletching position that we chose was the one that tore the most vertical. And most of the time, that vertical tear was a Nock low tear. So that was where our point is above our fletching in our Nock. So just picture, in an exaggerated form that this bolt is flying through our piece of paper with just its nose in the air. What we found that if we didn't get a perfect bullet hole and we picked this Nock low tear, if we added point weight, we were able to find a point at which basically the bolt leveled out and was then flying through that piece of paper, either perfect or near perfect. If you happen to start with a higher point weight and you got a Nock high tear, you can do the exact opposite. Nock high tear is your bolt, again, exaggerated form. It is flying through that piece of paper, nose diving. It is nose low, tail high, point low, Nock high. And if you subtract some point weight, you can also level it out. But if you're going to mess around with point weights, again, I would suggest start with that 100 grain. If you don't get a perfect bullet hole, look for that tear that is Nock low, or your most vertical one, which should be a Nock low, and then start adding point weight to level that out to where you get close to a perfect bullet hole. And if you go beyond that point, so if you level it out and then you keep increasing point weight, you should start to see your bolt flying the exact opposite. You started with this Nock low tear, you leveled it out by adding point weight. If you add more, it should turn into a Nock high tear, where that bolt is then nose diving. So that is how you kind of combine the Nock tune with adding or subtracting point weight to find that sweet spot that your bow shoots best for that particular type of bolt. Once you find a point weight that works best, we found that after we did the first bolt like that, that point weight then translated to each bolt after it was Nock tuned. So you still had to Nock tune every single bolt, but once you did, you could go right to that point weight and get basically a perfect bullet hole. Okay, so that's kind of the paper tuning process for your crossbow in a nutshell. Just a couple other things I want to touch on here. If you're going to mess with point weight, I highly recommend the Ranch Fairy tuning kit. That's what we used when we messed around with this stuff. We bought it from Ethics Archery. I do think there are a couple manufacturers now that offer Ranch Fairy tuning kits or similar tuning kits where you can basically buy a pack of field points that range from like 100 to 200 grains in 25 grain increments, or 200 to 300 grains in 25 grain increments. They're great to use for this. We bought the Ethics Archery Ranch Fairy tuning kit, the 200 to 300 grain, and then we had just 100 grain field points laying around. We had 125s laying around. We ended up buying some cheap Amazon 150 grain field points. So we basically had everything covered from 100 to 300 grains, with the exception of 175. So we had 100s, 125s, 150s, 200s, 225s, 250s, 275s, 300s. That worked perfectly for us. When you find a point weight that works for your bolt, know that you're really finding a total upfront weight. So you've got to consider both your point and the insert that you were shooting. So you kind of have one of two options when you find that weight up front that works for your bolt. So you can either leave your stock insert in there, totally fine, and then buy practice points and buy broadheads that match the the field point that you found to shoot the best. That's totally fine. Or you could remove the stock insert, replace it with a heavier insert, and shoot a lighter practice point or lighter broadhead. As long as your total upfront weight is the same, everything should shoot just like you tuned it for. So an example, if you need one for clarification, let's say the bolt that you were using liked a 200 grain Ranch Fairy field point. And you found that your stock insert was 25 grains. So what you actually tuned to was a total upfront weight of your bolt as 225 grains. You could leave the stock insert in, go buy some 200 grain field points, some 200 grain broadheads, shoot that no problem. But let's say you don't want to buy 200 grain broadheads, or you can't find one that you like. You could go buy let's say a 100 grain insert, put that in your bolt, and then buy 125 grain field points and broadheads. Either way, your total upfront weight that you tune to is 225 grains, and it should work just like you tuned it. Okay, so one other thing that we noticed that you might notice as well is if you try some different bolts, you will see a difference between, I'm going to call them generic or quote unquote cheap bolts versus premium bolts, more expensive bolts. There's nothing wrong with either of them. You can tune cheap bolts or expensive bolts, but I think what you'll see and what the paper will show you is that those cheaper bolts, just because they're not manufactured to the tightest of tolerances, both for straightness as well as the spine or the variance between the strong side and the weak side, those are going to have probably some bigger tears between your three knock positions. And even when you add point weight, you might see some variability in bolts that shoot perfect bullet holes or bolts that just they don't. Even when you knock tune all of them, even when you find one that's like, hey, this one shoots perfect with this point weight, I'm going to knock tune the rest of them and I'm going to put that same point weight on them. You might find some that are good and some that aren't quite there. Just know that, and just mark them if that's what you're going to hunt with. And again, totally fine to hunt with them. I've hunted with them before and I've killed plenty of stuff with them. You might just have to segregate, these are the bolts that I'm actually going to put broadheads on and hunt with because these are my best ones. These ones over here, these are my practice ones. Or they're all your practice ones, but when you go hunting, this is the bolt that I'm going to shoot first. This is my number one bolt. This is my number two. This is my number three. If you use or if you tune with a more premium bolt, you're going to see some better tears through paper for each of the fletching positions. And what you also might see is the more premium ones seem to have a point weight window at which the bolt will shoot perfect bullet holes with different point weights. So I'll give you a bolt, for example, the Sirius Phoenix. That's our favorite, or that's my favorite. That one I can shoot 3 different point weights with after it's knock tuned, and it still shoots perfect bullet holes. With the insert that it has in it, which is a heavier one, I can shoot 100, 125, and 150s, and it'll still print perfect bullet holes. One of those Carbon Express carbon cross bolts, I've tuned those. I've got them shooting really well, but those ones are you have 1 point weight. And if you go 25 grains less or 25 grains more than that point weight on them, you start to see a deterioration in your bolt flight and bigger tears. So just a couple things to note. If you're playing with cheap versus premium, or you want to tinker around with stuff, we certainly have seen that some of the more expensive bolts, even though obviously they're a little harder on the wallet, they are definitely easier on the paper and easier to tune. All right, so let's wrap this up with what can you expect to see when you shoot your field points again, a mechanical broadhead, or a fixed blade broadhead. So to start with your field points, I think you're going to notice something. It just might not be a drastic change. So I certainly noticed some increased field point accuracy, and I noticed some bolt to bolt better field point consistency. But my crossbow shot field points pretty good before, and really the reason for that is a field point is the easiest thing for your bolt and the fletchings on your bolt to correct if there's erratic bolt flight. So you might not see a ton untuned bolt with field points versus tuned bolt to field points, but I think you will see some. Let's move to a mechanical broadhead. I think you're going to see an even greater amount with a mechanical broadhead. And I know that mechanicals are super, super close in the way they fly to field points. They're not questioning that or doubting that. But I also know that most mechanical broadheads are not exactly the same aerodynamic profile as a field point. So there is a little bit extra out there catching wind that if your bolt was flying erratic, there would be some accuracy loss, some speed loss, some energy loss. So with a tuned bolt that you just did with this paper tuning process, I think you can expect to see your mechanical broadheads fly a little bit better and your bolt to bolt mechanical broadheads be more consistent. Now, where this process really, really shines and what was the biggest eye opener to me as well as my buddies who did this was the fixed blade broadhead flight. So before, when we had tried fixed blade broadheads, they flew like freaking wiffle balls attached to the end of our crossbow bolts. I mean, we would get some that would shoot good, and we were like, okay, I think I could hunt with that. But the rest of our bolts or the other broadheads that were in that pack, they were just all over the place. Like we could not get any consistency, didn't really know how to adjust our scope. You're picking one bolt and like adjusting your scope to it and kind of hoping for the best. With this tuned process, we saw a just amazing increase in fixed blade broadhead accuracy. So left to right, we saw our bolts with a fixed blade basically flew perfect. Left to right was perfect. They flew normally just a little bit low of our field point. And, listening to some of the things that the Ranch Fairy has said, as well as I guess what we've noticed, it just seems that with those extra blades, the extra kind of wings out there, they just fly a little heavy. But with that tuned bolt, with it leaving your bow, basically perfect or near perfect right from the get-go, you don't have those big wings out there catching air, combined with erratic bolt flight. So that's the reason why if you've had bad fixed blade accuracy with your crossbow, it's because it's coming out of your bow goofy, and that fixed blade broadhead is just kind of a big wing attached to the front of your bolt that even though your fletchings are trying to correct things, that fixed blade is grabbing air and just exaggerating that erratic bolt flight. So with a tuned one, you should see left to right very, very good. You just might see that those broadheads fly a little bit heavy and impact a little bit lower than your field point. And I guess for a couple of examples that my friends and I have shot for broadheads, so we've shot the Magnus Black Hornets. I shot some single bevel broadheads actually this year out of my crossbow. They were the Cutthroats. We have shot Iron Wills, and I feel like there's one other one, but I can't remember it. Either way, we got we'll just say those three broadheads flying perfect left to right, hitting just a tad low. And when I say a tad low, I'm saying like 2 to 3 inches at 40 yards is what we experienced. That we then just for that adjusted our scope just a little bit for our broadheads, and then we were basically perfect shooting. I mean, I was shooting, a 2-inch by 2-inch piece of tape at 40 yards with a cutthroat single bevel 150 grain broadhead coming out of a Killer Instinct SWAT XP that, is rated for 415 feet per second. I mean, something we hadn't done before. So I think, from field point to expandable to fixed blade, you're going to see more impact from doing this paper tuning process as you go from field point to expandable to fixed blade. And I really think, I think this is going to help you guys a lot, because it certainly helped me, certainly helped my buddies. We will do this process on every bow, every bolt, every broadhead that we plan on trying, just because it was a huge eye opener for us. And I hope you try it, and I hope that this podcast help you understand how to do it, why to do it, and what you can expect from it. And I just really hope you enjoyed. So let me know, you guys, in the comments below of this podcast video here on YouTube. Please tell me what you thought of the podcast. Also, tell me what you guys want to see for other episodes. I've got some things planned, but I would love to have a segment, whether it be questions from you guys that I can talk about, or I can have somebody on the show talk about that you just want answered, or topics for an entire podcast that you want to hear about. Please list them in those comments below, or you can email me at dragondeer@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to read your suggestions, your comments, your episode questions, or even if you have feedback from me for how to make this podcast more beneficial for you guys, I am all ears. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week right here on the Bent Limbs podcast.